In the 11th edition of this biography, I think I can fairly say I've got grace. There came to me a most famous feminine sea captain called Gráinne Ní Mháille, with 3 galleys and 200 fighting men. She brought with her husband, for she was as well by sea as by land, well more than Mrs. Mate with him, who wrote the trousers and other words. This was a notorious woman in all the coasts of Ireland. This fascinating image was one of the very first accounts of Grace O'Maly I unearthed among the English state papers of the 16th century, when I first started out of my own voyage to find her. And this was written by Sir Henry Sidney, the English Lord Deputy of Ireland, in 1577, when then on an official visit here to Galway City, he met by then the most famous feminine sea captain. Now, as a child on my annual family holiday spent on shores of Clew Bay, I heard the legends and folklore about Grace O'Maly. Gráinne Ní Mháille, the ferocious, bald-headed virago and pirate, terror of the seas, who banged on the door of Queen Elizabeth I's palace, demanding admittance as an equal. In poetry, too, we heard Patrick Pearse's Óráise de Hawaii, where Grace was portrayed as a figure of fiery patriotism, sword in hand, leading the fight for Irish freedom. And yet she never appeared in my school history books, which made me wonder, as indeed I'm sure many others, did she ever exist, or was she just another myth? Folklore, however, and as I subsequently found out, while it may have tended to exaggerate her story, it must also be acknowledged for at least keeping Grace O'Malley's memory alive. And indeed, in doing so, shows us also what an impact she must have made on her own time, in her own area, to be remembered in folk memory by stories told and retold from fireside to fireside for the subsequent 500 years. Generations of Irish historians, on the other hand, including, may I add, the Annals of the Four Masters, which was written, as you possibly know, in the early decades of the 16th century, just after her death, they ignored her and her story and the part she played by land and by sea in the traumatic decades of the 16th century. And why did this happen? Well, like many of her sisters, Grace O'Maly was no doubt a victim of the mainly male orientation of history. But more than mere chauvinism contributed to Grace O'Malley's being airbrushed from our past. For in the past, Irish heroines were required to fit a specific mould, adorned in the green cloak of patriotism, their personal lives untainted, their religious beliefs firmly Roman Catholic. Grace O'Maly, as I found, who allowed neither social nor political nor religious convention to stand in her way, simply did not readily conform to what this dutiful, subservient, God-fearing picture of Gaelic womanhood promoted by later generations of historians. It took her perceived enemies, the English administrators and the military men who came to conquer the country in the 16th century, to record her, and this is where I found her. So who was Grace O'Maly? When she was born around the year 1530, her father was a chieftain of the area known as Ul Eithel, and this was the territory on the southern shore of Clew Bay. The O'Mallys did own all of the area north of Clew Bay as well, but when the famous de Burgos came to conquer Connacht in the 12th century, that part of the O'Malley territory had to be handed over to the de Burgos, who became one of the advancing so-called enemies, whom, as we know from our history books, became more Irish than the Irish themselves over subsequent centuries. So by Grace's birth, the south shore of Clew Bay, stretching from Killery Harbour, including such iconic landmarks as Crowbatterick, Killery Harbour, a multitude of islands, including Achill, Inishturk, Inishbofel, and of course Clear Island. And that stretched all over, cross into Westport and halfway onwards towards Castlebar. Now, it's interesting to note that Grace O'Malley's mother was also an O'Malley, a different sect of the O'Malley family. So while Grace mentions a brother, Domhnall na Piaba, Domhnall of the pipes, whether he's given to music or drinking a little too much from the wine cask, we don't know, but he was established in Cahirnamarth, which now, of course, is Westport. And she may have been the only child of the union of her father and mother. And I say this because she later states herself that she was sole heir to her mother, Margaret, from whom she inherited land in her own right. And I found this was confirmed in record I found in the old public record office in the Four Courts. Indeed, it bore evidence, this particular document, of the Civil War 1922 fire, where her son, Grace O'Malley's son, Thibaut Long, who we talk about soon, claimed the same lands in the Court of Chancery as heir of his mother, Gráinne. It is interesting to note also that the old Gaelic or Brehon law was far more liberal to women in terms of property, marriage, dowry and divorce than that pertaining in England and on the continent in the time, where a woman on her marriage became the mere chattel, as did her property of her husband. This did not happen in Gaelic law, and Grace O'Malley is a great example of that. So Grace O'Malley was twice endowed with O'Malley blood. The sea then is in her DNA. So she was born into a maritime family, and indeed if she had been a male O'Malley, well, I certainly wouldn't have written a biography, we wouldn't be speaking about her today. She later testifies herself that from a very early age she was instructed in the art and adventure of seafaring. And indeed, of all the Irish clans, and there were around 40, Ireland was divided into around 40 different clans at this period, and indeed before. The ancient annals of Ireland, and indeed the poets found poems going back to the 12th century, all testify to the O'Malley clan's unique association with all things maritime. The Lions of the Green Sea, one poem calls them, in the 12th century. They sailed and traded their clan produce, such as tallow, hides, fish, from Scotland to Spain. And there was a sound economic reason, as indeed there is for most things in this period. It always boils down to the completely money in the end. Galway City, as we know, was ruled by 40 merchant tribes, the descendants of the old Anglo-Normans. And in the 16th century, Galway port was really the major commercial port in Ireland, even overshadowing Dublin. It was the largest importer of wine, for example, into Ireland. And over the centuries, the City Council had enacted numerous racist bylaws against the Gaelic neighbouring clans. One which I found, it says, "Neither a no nor a mac shall strut ne swiver through the streets of Galway." So not very wankily, very different from today. And as well as that, they also imposed taxes and charges on the Gaelic ploughs who wanted to trade here. So in retaliation, really, and out of necessity, the O'Malleys traded directly with Spain and Scotland and France. And perhaps in retaliation to what the merchant princes did, they also took tolls on the ships trading here into Galway. Indeed, regardless of their nationality, be they Spanish, English or French, it was all the same. They had to pay a toll for sailing safely through these waters. The O'Malleys also acted as pilots for ships of the many nations. We have to remember that there was no accurate map of Ireland at the time. So to become a pilot was a very lucrative pastime for the ships sailing from various countries along this dangerous coastline. The Scottish gallows glasses, these were the mercenaries imported by the Gaelic chieftains to fight in their various intertribal feuds. The O'Malley ships also brought these in from the Hebrides and from the west coast of Scotland. Indeed, there are references to O'Malley raids on the lands along the Atlantic from Scotland right up to Scotland, recorded in ancient annals and manuscripts. But we have to remember also that piracy, which the O'Malleys also engaged in, was part and parcel of the life of seafaring communities everywhere, from Cornwall to the South China Seas to the west coast of Ireland. It didn't matter. A little bit of piracy was always part of the maritime business. For a woman, however, regardless of her background, seafaring in the 16th century was no cakewalk. Superstitions about women and the sea abounded in almost every known culture. Women at sea were looked on as the devil's bast, a bad omen, the harbinger of squalls and shipwreck. From the ancient epics of Jason Ulysses to Grace O'Malley's contemporaries Drake and Raleigh, there was no place for a woman on board ship, and most certainly not at the helm. Seafaring, indeed, let's be honest, ladies, as a choice for women today is very, very rare indeed. I think if you asked a classroom of young girls what they would like to be, I doubt if one hand would walk to say they want a career around the sea. So it still is a bit of a barrier to us liberated women. To survive throughout her long life on the wide and dangerous Atlantic Ocean, Grace had to know about canvas, hawser, ballast, and anchor, to navigate by star and compass, to know the perils of the treacherous Irish coastline with its protruding rocky headlands, hidden reefs and shallows, to know when to set sail and when to stay ashore, to assess the capability of the ships she commanded as well as the crews she led. Conditions on board were primitive, privacy non-existent. For a woman's physique, it must have been intolerable. Skin toughened under the barrage of wind and salt spray, hands calloused and nails split by hawser and canvas, bare feet and body chafed from roughly hewn swaying decks and sodden woolen clothes, indigestible cold food, the discharge of bodily functions lacking any comfort or privacy. To give birth on the high seas, as Grace later did, seems to us unimaginable. To be a female captain at the helm of a fleet, commanding hard-bitten male sailors, she had to be both courageous, in command, and above all, successful at what she herself described her trade of maintenance by land and sea. But the sea brought positives too. For seafaring people like the O'Malleys, the sea was a highway to new countries, cultures, markets, and above all to news and information. It could be said that the sea in the 16th century was the tech highway, and which Grace O'Malley used to her advantage throughout her long life. Any idea that Grace was shut away from a world in a remote corner of the west of Ireland is, to judge by her own correspondence and that of others written about her, simply ridiculous. She was au fait with which was happening in the wider world outside. We know from the English state papers of the period also that her father, Dudara O'Malley, issued licenses to Spanish, French, and English fishermen to fish what he considered to be his exclusive and fertile sea domain of his territory. And with such visitors from abroad came the happenings of what was happening in Europe and England, as well as knowledge of other languages and cultures. These records also reveal that Grace O'Malley both understood and spoke English. From her many encounters with English administrators and militiamen, such as Sidney, there is never a mention of that need of a translator. That she spoke Latin to Queen Elizabeth and was forced to speak in Latin or communicate Latin to Queen Elizabeth, I'm afraid, just another folk tale. Also another folk tale was that Grace O'Malley may have been bald, but now. The old O'Malley name is Mháille, and I'm sure there are still some Mháilles living here in the city of Galway today. The O'Malley is an anglicised version of the name, and as we know, the name, the word Mháille in the Irish language means bald. So a Victorian fiction writer of a period demanded that now she becomes bald. So we have to put that little thing to rest as well. Her first marriage, it's often forgotten that Grace O'Maly belongs to the Gaelic aristocracy. I think we here in Ireland seem to associate an aristocracy exclusively with English titles, whereas Gaelic Ireland, like every known culture in the world, had its own indigenous ruling class, and long before the Anglo-Normans became established here in the 12th century. Therefore, as the daughter of a ruling chieftain, she had obligations both to her family and to her clan to make a politically advantageous marriage. One which she made at 16 years of age was the arranged marriage between herself and Domhnall an Chogaidh, Domhnall of the Battles O'Flaherty of the barony of Ballynahinch, west of Galway City, and whose main castle was Bunowen on the sea. Now, the present castle, which many of you may pass on your way down to the golf club there in Connemara, that was a later castle built for Edmund McGagan, a Cromwellian plantation who was taken, his own land was taken in Westmeath, and he was transplanted down here in the mid-1600s at the expense of Grace O'Malley's grandson, Murrough-ne-Maor O'Flaherty. But the stones from the original Bunowen castle, I heard, actually went into that McGagan castle that is there today. Now, Domhnall an Chogaidh was the elected cornerstone to the overall powerful O'Flaherty clan. In other words, he was the chieftain in waiting to be set up in their prime castle, which is, of course, Muir. The O'Flahertys had a very troubled relationship with the merchants in Galway City, and indeed over the old west gate of Galway City was written, "From the ferocious O'Flahertys, good Lord, deliver us." As a daughter of a chieftain, Grace brought a substantial dowry to her marriage, a third of which, by right of Brehon law, was to be restored to her in the event of the death or divorce of her husband. Divorce was part and parcel of Brehon law and was availed equally by men and women. Grace became the mother of 3 children: Owen, her eldest, Murrough, known as Murrough-ne-Maor, and Margaret, named after her own mother. Now, Domhnall an Chogaidh, as his name typifies, was a typical Gaelic chieftain of the period, given to feuding, capital raiding, and fighting with his neighbours. A long-running feud with the neighbouring Joyce clan over possession of a strategic castle on Loch Corrib, known as Cox Castle, was to be his downfall, and he was killed by defending it against a Joyce raid. This is where Grace O'Maly took up her arms to help to get the castle back, which she did. The O'Flaherty clansmen agreed to be led by her, and so successful was the event that the castle was renamed very quickly Hens Castle, and that is the name it has to this day. However, her dowry, as she herself later testified, was illegally withheld from her by the O'Flahertys, and this is possibly one of the reasons why Grace O'Maly returns now to her father's territory and settles on Clare Island. Before she left, I would like to say as well that there was another connection with Grace O'Maly and with here in County Galway, and that is in Renville Castle. The old name of the castle was called Curra Castle, and a shot from her cannon was preserved there for many, many generations by a family near the hotel. And I found an old poem which actually preserved that incident, and it said, "No braver seaman took a deck in hurricane or squalls, since Grace O'Maly battered down old Curra Castle walls." So it's lovely to have that remembered both in local folklore and also in poetry. Grace's second son of her marriage to Domhnall, known as Murrough-ne-Maor O'Flaherty, became chieftain of the barony of Ballynahinch, and on his death in Bunowen Castle in 1626, and according to his will, which I found, he's buried here in Galway City in the Franciscan Abbey. As I said, his son, Murrough-ne-Maor O'Flaherty, was dispossessed of his lands by the Cromwellian confiscations in 1653. Following the death of her husband, as I said, Grace now moves back to her father's territory and settles on Clare Island. And it is here really the legend of the Pirate Queen starts. Clansmen from other clans, and it's easy to say that, but given the inter-clan division and the feuding which was endemic in Gaelic Ireland at this time, she continued her family's tradition of toll-taking ships sailing along the coast, raiding from Donegal down around to Waterford, her galleys bringing in the infamous great red shank gallo glasses, and mercenaries from Scotland, and all of this gave rise to the legend of the Pirate Queen. Her second marriage was her own choice this time, and it was to Richard in Erin Burke, B-O-U-R-K-E. As you know, the great de Bourgh family divided over the centuries. The Galway Burkes became B-U-R-K-E, and the Mayo Burkes had the B-O-U-R-K-E. And both of them had titles called MacWilliam. And here in Galway, the Burkes who subsequently became the Earls of Banrickard, they initially were the MacWilliam Upwa, the upper MacWilliam, not denigrating the Mayo MacWilliam, the MacWilliam Upper, because just that they were nearer to Rome. And you always had the upper, it was nearer to Rome, and Galway, of course, is more south than Mayo. Now, Richard was again tarnished to succeed to the then MacWilliam of Mayo, the second most powerful chieftain in Connacht, next to the MacWilliam here in Galway. Richard had many castles dotted along the northern shore of Clew Bay, but Rockfleet is the one, Carrick-on-Cowley is the one most associated with race. And why is that? Because even today, the people with boats there will tell you it's a very, very safe mooring and quite a deep harbour. Rockfleet also had a very special connection with Galway City, for in March 1579, the merchants, so fed up with many raids on the ships entering into Galway, sent an army by sea led by a Captain Martin, who obviously must have been connected to one of the merchant princes here of the city, and funded by the Galway merchants, and it was recorded. This expedition sailed from Galway on the 8th of March, 1579, but so spirited was the defence made by this extraordinary one that they were obliged to retreat on the 26th. She endured a siege for that long and yet turned it on the besiegers. And they were obliged to retreat on the 26th of the same month and very narrowly escaped being made prisoner. That's her status as a leader must have soared after that. To come back to Richard on Erin, tradition, I always thought of him as, going around in musty old suit of armour, inherited from his Anglo-Norman ancestors. But of course, as I found, he had iron mines on his land. Mm-hmm. And there you'd see it still, there's a name Furnace if you go from Newport on to Mulranny. The iron mines both were up there, and these same iron played a great role in the siege of Limerick 100 years later. It was said that their marriage was a trial marriage. Now, again, that was allowable under Gráinne Ní Mháille, that people from the ascendancy tended to see further fit from one another, so it was very, very civilized, and if they weren't, both parties could withdraw from the alliance and move on. And it was said that Grace's had this trial marriage, but of course I find that a few years later she gave birth to Tippet alone on board her ship. When she was returning from either a trading or a piracy raid, she went into labour and the child was born on board her ship. And it was also said that the day after his birth, her ship was attacked by Algerian pirates. So everybody said, well, here it goes. This is a mad, crazy story. But when you look at the period of time, there were very many attacks by the pirates off the Barbary coast all up along the coast of Ireland. And the fact that folklore kept this incident in Grace O'Malley's life told and retold over 500 years, there certainly must be some element of truth in it. That was the birth of Tibbet Lum, and he was the one who succeeded Grace O'Malley at sea, and hence his name Tibbet Lum, but also perhaps because he was born aboard her ship. I want to talk a little bit about the political background here. When the expansionary and colonisation policies of her great contemporary Queen Elizabeth I of England impacted on Ireland in the latter decades of the 16th century, Grace O'Maly's political abilities in that arena came into play. Now, the political background, as I say, is essential to understand the faction story of both Grace O'Maly and indeed her family. International politics, let's have a look at them. The Catholic Philip of Spain, who had been married to Queen Mary, Elizabeth's half-sister, had his eyes on England. Pope Pius V excommunicated Queen Elizabeth in 1570. Ireland, there was no united Ireland at the time. As I said, it was divided into about 40 chieftaincies, like Grace's father. And some of the old English lords, like the Desmonds, who had become Gaelicised, less Gaelicised, the Earls of Kildare, who were just loyal to themselves. In England, the Tudors had hammered out monarchy from a similar disunity among the warring nobility there during the War of the Roses some decades earlier. But by the 16th century, Ireland, however, there was still no concept of a state. It was all about the individual ruler. So you fought with your neighbour and aligned with the English to help you if it got you over that bump in the road. Before the English expansion that started around the 1560s started, England's power in Ireland was really confined to Dublin and the area known around it as the Pale. With Spanish ambitions on the continent, however, in the latter half of the 16th century, to hold England, Elizabeth knew she must also hold Ireland because it was, as she considered it, the unguarded back door into England by England's enemies. There was an old saying at the time that said, "He that will England win, first with Ireland must begin." Therefore, the actions and aims of Grace O'Maly and her family, now especially her son Timothy, we won't be talking too much about him today, maybe I'll come back and talk about him. Very interesting, he became the first Viscount Mayo. They need to be examined within this traumatic context. There's no Ireland to fight for, no flag, no ideology per se. Survival was the motivation, the only fact to follow as the old antiquated Gaelic world resisted takeover politically and militarily from a more powerful and advanced Tudor England in a struggle for control of the land of Ireland from which there could be only one winner. But there was another reason for England's wish to take over Ireland other than just being strategic. This is the age of exploration, and with it comes the exploitation of those discovered. Ireland, its fertile pasture lands, abundant lakes and rivers, vast forests and woodlands, became the El Dorado for younger sons of English landed gentry in the merchant classes. Wasn't it easier for them to cross the Irish Sea than have to take on the burdens of going across to the New World? So as the English administration spread out from its headquarters in Dublin and the Pale, the English sought at first to get the Irish chieftains on their side through diplomacy by granting titles and ownership of their lands by English law, which was in total opposition to Brehon law. A chieftain only held the land in trust for his clansmen. But now the English were saying to the Gaelic chieftains, if you take on English law and rule by English law and start being English, you yourself personally will own that land. So there was a huge opposition to that. And it's against the Brehon custom, where the Gaelic chieftain ruled just for his life. In 1576, when the then William of Mayo submitted and agreed to rule by English law, meaning that his son would inherit now the title and the lands, this was to have consequences for Grace O'Maly and her husband Richard and Aaron, who was the elected Taoiseach to the MacWilliamship by Gaelic law. So when the English Lord Deputy, Sir Henry Sidney, who was the Queen's representative in Ireland, on a tour of the West of Ireland, arrived here in Galway in 1576, that's why Grace, now in her middle years, sailed into Galway to meet him, and Sidney wrote the wonderful pen picture that I I quoted earlier. And this document also revealed that Sidney's own son, the famous poet, Elizabeth's favourite courtier, Sir Philip Sidney, had come to Galway to meet up with his father. And Sir Henry says, "This woman did my son also meet. He can tell you more of her." He writes and tells Queen Elizabeth that. So you wonder what conversation this mature sea pirate leader had with this celebrity courtier, Sir Philip Sidney, and what news he brought back to court about this extraordinary woman. It's amazing, really. These are the little incidents that make her come alive. While in Galway, too, Sir Henry Sidney asked Grany O'Maly would she conduct her in her galley on a tour of the city's defences, which by the 16th century had been dilapidated. And she did that. And he duly paid her the fee. She remembered. And all of that is in the state papers. Grace's meeting with Sidney in Galway, however, made no change to her more usual trade. And a few months after their meeting, she was captured while leading a plundering raid on Thomond and brought to Askeaton Castle, the main residence of the powerful Earl of Desmond. She was imprisoned in that massive castle and later after that in Limerick jail, before Desmond handed her over to the English. Now, we have to explain that. Desmond was under suspicion of being in league with King Philip II of Spain, and he needed time. And Grany O'Maly bought him that time. So when the English governor of Munster, Drury, came banging on the door of Askeaton Castle, Desmond said, "Well, I'm so loyal that I'm going to hand you over this great pirate." And William Drury wrote about this. He said, "Gráinne O'Maly, famous for her stoutness of courage and person." She's in her middle years now, maybe beginning to put on a little weight. A woman who had impudently passed the part of one of them and has been a great spoiler and chief commander and director of thieves and murderers at sea, had come to spoil this province. Drury brought her through Ireland, and going through Ireland in the 16th century, crossing rivers and streams that had no bridges, going through vast areas of forests. He brought her up and she was put into Dublin Castle. Now, only the most important political prisoners were ever imprisoned in Dublin Castle, and was there she spent an entire year. She was there until the middle of 1578 and was released. And we don't know why. I think that Richard and Arne went into a rebellion down here against the English, would now begin to creep in here into Connacht. And to bring him to heel, because as Sidney said, she was well more than Mrs. Lately, the English decided to release her from Dublin Castle. Now, the subsequent recall of Sir Henry Sidney in 1578, he was replaced by a far more military-minded and puritanical English administration. Diplomacy went out the window, and they set out to conquer Ireland by the sword by using one of the oldest and most effective military tactics of all, divide and conquer. To push chieftains into rebellion meant if they died in rebellion, their land were automatically confiscated. For example, 500,000 acres of the Earl of Desmond, whom he was killed in 1583, were up for grabs, and we know that Sir Walter Raleigh and indeed the poet and administrator Edmund Spencer got a lot of that. In 1580, on the death of the MacWilliam of Mayo, the most powerful title in Mayo, property over 6,000 acres and overlordship of chieftains of the entire county, numerous castles, including the chief one in Loch Mask, who was in receipt of tributes and dues from dozens of his underlords. This was a title worth fighting for. But now Brehon and English law clashed, as Richard sought the title by right of Brehon law and MacWilliam's heir and son sought it by English law. So Grace and Richard amalgamated their forces, which were said to number, and I quote, 1,200 Scottish mercenaries, 300 Kern, they were the old foot soldiers, the Gaelic foot soldiers, and 200 horsemen, far more than their rival. And with the English already embroiled in the rebellion of the Earl of Desmond in Munster, they were forced to make a deal with Grace and her husband. And one of the most extraordinary documents I found in Westport House. The family, of course, are descended from the Grany O'Maly. It was bestowing a Gaelic title, the MacWilliam, which she had banned, but with an English gloss by Queen Elizabeth I, because she gave, to put an English gloss on the MacWilliam, old Gaelic MacWilliam title, she had ennobled Richard, and he became Sir Richard in Ireland, and Grace became the Lady MacWilliam. And here in Galway in 1581, at a gathering in the then English administrator's main office, which was here in Galway City, there's a gathering of the old Gaelic nobility and those who had agreed to rule by English law. And the English governor, Sir Nicholas Malby, wrote about meeting all of them and singles Grany O'Maly out, and he describes her as thinketh herself to be no small lady. And I often think, did she have some spectacular gun that she had got in Spain on one of her travels? She was acting out now as Lady MacWilliam and was singled out by the English governor as that. And it gives us again a glimpse of this woman behind the quiet home. However, when Richard and she refused to pay the conditions of their deal with the English, Grace and her army prevented the English from entering her husband's territory, as the English rent collector Theobald Dillon reported. I went towards the place where MacWilliam was, who met me and his wife, Gráinne Ní Mháille, with all their force, and did swear that they would have my life for coming into their country, and especially so his wife. Dillon was forced to back off because, as he also admitted in his report, I being but 130 footmen and 50 horsemen, and they were a far greater number than that. Scarcely 3 years as the MacWilliam of Mayo, Richard died. I often think he's a new age man. He never lost his status as a leader by having a wife who, I suppose, usurped his position, who did something that women didn't do and still don't do today at the time. And he never lost that standing among his contemporaries. He allowed his wife such freedom without affecting his own status. So this, by time 1583, Grace is a widow again, and to ensure this time that her dowry was not taken or withheld from her, she took Rockfleet Castle, and she talks about moving herself, her ships, and her army into Rockfleet Castle in lieu of her dowry to Richard. In 1586, a man called Bingham arrived as governor of Connacht. Puritan, militaristic and aggressive towards the Gaelic chieftains. The Gaelic chieftains could never be conquered but by the sword, he said. And from the start, Bingham's antagonism to Grace as a woman is very clear. He describes her in his correspondence to the English court as, and I quote, a notable traitor and nurse to all rebellions in Ireland for 40 years. I shall never ask of a boat of 30 tons to drive her and all her fleet into the sea. But it took a long time to do it. Grace now emerges as a military leader in her own right on her land, and she led 3 rebellions in Mayo against Bingham's harsh rule. A brother of the governor, Bingham, John Bingham, arrived in Connemara, and Grany O'Maly's eldest son, Owen, was then chieftain of Bunowen. And Bingham forced him to move with all his followers and his cattle and sheep herds into O'Maly Island, which I'm sure you all know. And it was there that Owen was killed. And Grany O'Maly, in her own correspondence to England, talks about counting 12 deadly wounds on my son's body. His younger brother Murrough succeeded him, and Grace heard the rumour that he had sided with the Binghams. So what did she do? One of the most fascinating episodes in her life, and one which Elizabeth, when they met later on, alludes to. Grace O'Maly, being out of charity with her son Murrough for siding with the English, manned out her navy of galleys and landed at Ballynahinch where he dwelleth, burned his town and spoiled his people of their cattle and goods, and murdered 3 or 4 of his men. Some mother, some chastisement of son. Later, however, Bingham captured her, and Grace again testified, I was apprehended and tied with a rope, and spoiled of my cattle, and brought to Sir Richard Bingham, who caused a new pair of gallows to be made for me, where I thought I would end my days. She was freed by all the Mayo chieftains coming to hand in hostages. So important was she to them from a strategic and military point, and of course from a naval point of view as well. And her own son-in-law was Richard Burke, who was the chieftain of the area all around Curran Peninsula in Achill, and her young daughter Margaret O'Flaherty had been married to him. And they all handed in their hostages, and she had to be then allowed to release them. But when Bingham then took her young son Tillit hostage, he had him incarcerated in Sligo Castle, and it's there where he met Maud O'Connor Sligo, the sister of the ruling chieftain. And he married Maud O'Connor Sligo, and they both are buried in Ballynahinch Abbey in the beautiful tomb there dedicated to them. And when Tibbet was eventually released, he returned to Mayo and initially became involved in a new confederation that was slowly evolving in Ulster, led by the chieftains O'Neill and Domhnall. And because of his sea power and status as leaders in Mayo, they needed to get Grace and her son on their side. Bingham accused Grace of being in league with the Ulster chieftains, a claim she repudiated by insinuating that her meeting with O'Neill came as a result, and I quote, her galley by a tempest being broken off Donegal, and she had to seek shelter with O'Neill. The Spanish Armada descended in 1588, and Bingham went on the rampage, accusing the O'Malleys and the Burkes of harbouring Spanish enemy. Mayo became devastated. Scorched earth policy, what we're seeing in Ukraine today and in Palestine, was happening in Connemara, but particularly in Mayo at the time. It was, however, to protect her family and followers and their lands from English military takeover and economic chaos that ensured that initially compelled Grace to intercede directly with Queen Elizabeth. Backed into a corner by Bingham, her most determined enemy, Grace boldly went over his head. Her first petition, dated November 1592, to the English court demonstrates as skillful, shrewd negotiator, as Machiavellian as the court officials she sought to convince. Damned by Bingham and others in their dispatches to the English court as a notable traitor, with the catalogue of rebellion, piracy and other disloyal activities are now registered against her. In her own correspondence, Grace shrewdly counteracts such accusations by implying that because of the discord sown by Bingham and others, she had no option but to take up arms to defend herself and her family and followers. She now offered instead to return to the sea, this time with the Queen's personal approval, and then the crunch line, without any interpretation or interruption from any person whatsoever, meaning, of course, Bingham. Grace's letter caught the attention of Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State, Sir William Cecil Lord Burleigh. This famous 16th century statesman, as I found, actually doodled comments on her letter, and I found the letter there in Burleigh's own hand. He tried to trace Grace O'Malley's family tree. You can imagine this great Elizabethan civil servant really was Elizabeth's most trusted, with her for 50 years, and working out Grace O'Malley's family connections. While her correspondence and offer was being considered by Burleigh in late 1592, when her beloved youngest son, Domhnall, was captured and sentenced to death by Bingham on a trumped-up charge of treason, which meant death, for conspiring to raise a rebellion with O'Rourke in Breffni, the time for negotiation with the English from a distance ended. allowed any mother in any place to save the life of her son, became her only goal, and was the reason for Grace O'Malley's famous meeting with Queen Elizabeth I. In early summer 1593, Grace followed her correspondence to London. One of the most interesting documents I found was a letter of introduction written by Black Tom, the Earl of Ormond from Kilkenny, to give Grace O'Malley coverage and protection in her voyage to London. A pirate, she would have seen it herself when she sailed off the Thames, the bodies of the pirates that had been found. The sentence on a pirate was you were hung up in a steel cage over the Thames, starved to death, and the birds of the air picture of Roddy Clew. And you could see all that in the 16th century because piracy, of course, was the end of a pirate. Now, she didn't go willy-nilly, and I found this letter of introduction by Black Tom. Now, who's Black Tom, and what has he got to do with Mayo? Go back to the de Burgo invasion. With the de Burgos had come the family of Black Tom. They had come here and they were connected to the Boleyns. So anybody connected to Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, had a great welcome at court. And Black Tom, the Earl of Ormond, was good looking as well, which helped a lot where Elizabeth was concerned. And he was one of her favourite courtiers. They had claimed the land that the de Burgos subsequently took from the O'Malley's. And now, because of all the confiscation of lands, they had started the butlers, through Black Tom, started to resurrect that ancient claim to the land. So in effect, he had become Grace O'Malley's landlord because Rockfield Castle was part of that land. Now, it's easy to say sailing up the Thames and sailing, it was a tough voyage to do, a mother trying to save her son, but she had this letter of protection from Black Tom, the Earl of Ormond. Grace and her crew were in London during the summer of 1593, seeking a way through the diplomatic minefield that surrounded Elizabethan court politics to try and get an audience with the Queen. Following his initial interest in her case, Burghley forwarded Grace while she was in London what became known as the 18 Articles of Interrogatory. In effect, they are 18 questions that Grace O'Malley has to answer before she gets admitted to Queen Elizabeth. So in effect, Grace O'Malley left us a potted autobiography. Now, when you read them, you'll see how smart and how au fait she was. She denies some things when she's asked about property because it's badly spelt or misspelt, and she says she doesn't know what it is, and she knows pretty well. They're fascinating, and in the last edition of the book, I actually had the publisher print them out as an appendix because they're very, very interesting and shows you how smart and how au fait she was with political happenings. In July 1593, following this, Grace was finally granted an audience with Queen Elizabeth at Greenwich Palace. It's now the National Maritime Museum and the other landmark buildings there. And I know I did some research there way back, and I remember going up the steps, and they told me in the Maritime Institute that the steps that I came up from the landing stage there in front were exactly the same that were there in the 16th century. They hadn't touched them, so it was a special moment, I must say, following in your footsteps. Both women were in their 60s. Now, I have to say, sadly, ladies, that was certainly well into your 80s in the 16th century. The average life expectancy of women was no more than 45 in the 16th century. Both women were in their 60s. At the apex of her power, the goddess heavenly bright of Spenser's Fairy Queen, vain, autocratic, with a cruel wit and razor-sharp tongue, Elizabeth could be coarse, bawdy, spat, and picture teeth. Her eyes now peered short-sightedly, for red hair had given way to a wig, her face a mask of rice powder and rouge. Her nose, as was recorded, grew, and I quote, grew as crooked as a harridan's. Her teeth were decayed and blackened. What age might have ravaged, Elizabeth sought to conceal by the sheer magnificence of her wardrobe. The harsh environment in which she operated, as well as her years, had left an imprint also on Grace O'Malley. Unlike Elizabeth, however, the furrows, wrinkles, and scars of age, salt spray, wind, and military action lay exposed on her face for all to see. Her physique was described then as tending for its stoutness. Her dress, while undoubtedly the best in her wardrobe, hardly matched the opulence of the Queen. One of the highlights of my research was finding the letter Queen Elizabeth wrote emanating from the meeting of these two remarkable female leaders. The letter is testimony to the audacity of Grace in persuading the English Queen to fly in the face of the advice of her own military governor in Ireland. For she not only saved her son from Bingham's gallows, but ensured her family's future security and prosperity. To judge by the subsequent inclusion of Grany O'Maly's name in the famous Boazio map of Ireland, the only woman ever listed on a national map, and this map was by the famous cartographer Boazio, was being prepared during Grany O'Maly's time with Queen Elizabeth at the English court, and her name is there written over a section of County Mayo. While Bingham was forced to free her son, he continued, however, to harass Grace both by land and by sea. As I subsequently found, this forced her to make a second visit to London in 1595, this time for a meeting with Burghley, whom Grace herself describes, and I quote, as my greatest friend since coming here, to present him with details of backing role Sir Richard Bingham's hard dealing against me and my family. Her intercession would appear to have been successful on the recall of Bingham as governor of Connacht in 1596. For herself, Grace was content to continue to lead her men by land and by sea until her death in 1603. One of the last recorded voyages made by this iconic female sea captain was leading a retaliatory attack on the island of the Scottish chieftain Rory MacNeill of Barr in the Outer Hebrides off the coast of Scotland at the ripe old age of 97 today. Grace died 1603, possibly at Rockfleet, shortly after her adversary and benefactor, Queen Elizabeth. It is perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, ironic that it was the English administrators and generals who had come to conquer her country who wrote Grany O'Maly into historic record. These Elizabethan artifacts are now faded and brittle, their age-darkened spider-like handwriting evidence of the passage of the 500 years since their authors first put quill to parchment. On deciphering the calligraphy of 16th century documents, the story of Grany O'Maly springs to life, to reveal a woman who broke the mold, breached boundaries of gender and bias, and who played a unique role in history. International focus on gender equality makes Grany O'Maly's life, although it was lived 500 years old, resonate even more today. She shines as an inspiration and beacon to what women everywhere can achieve, even like her, in the most difficult and demanding environments. And as ageism in society, particularly rapidly to older women, comes into greater focus today, that she retained her status as a woman of power and remained actively involved right to the end of her life undoubtedly makes Grany O'Maly a symbol of positive aging, and through her example the realization for all of us that age need not be a terminus, but just as it was for her, another port of call.